Some books get banned, some get burned. And then there are books that seem to fight back. Books that ruined, haunted, or outlived the people who wrote them. 5 books, 5 curses, and the last one on this list refused to die. Literally. The Picture of Dorian Gray. A beautiful young man wishes his portrait would age instead of him. The wish works. Dorian stays flawless for decades, while the painting in his attic rots, collecting every sin, every cruelty, every wrinkle he should have earned. It's vanity as a horror story, and it's brilliant. Oscar Wilde published it in 1890, and Victorian London lost its mind. Reviewers called it poisonous. One newspaper suggested the book belonged in the hands of the police. Wilde's response was very wild. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. Here's where the curse kicks in. 5 years later, Wilde sued a man for calling him, let's say, something you couldn't be in Victorian England. Big mistake. In court, the defense lawyer pulled out a copy of Dorian Gray and started reading Wilde's own novel back to him, line by line, as evidence against his character. The book about a man destroyed by his hidden life became Exhibit A in destroying its author's hidden life. Wilde lost. Then he was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. Prison broke his health. He died in a cheap Paris hotel at 46, reportedly saying the wallpaper was killing him and one of them had to go. Even dying, funnier than everyone in the room. Dorian's portrait absorbed his sins so he wouldn't have to face them. Wilde's novel did the opposite. It collected everything he was hiding and showed it to a jury. If Wilde's book betrayed him in court, the next author decided to destroy his book first, and it cost him everything. Nikolai Gogol was Russia's biggest literary star, and Dead Souls was his masterpiece. A savage comedy about a con man who travels the countryside buying dead peasants on paper to use them as collateral. Yes, that's the plot, and yes, it's genius. But Gogol had a problem. Part 1 mocked everything wrong with Russia. Part 2 was supposed to show the cure, and he couldn't write it. He rewrote it for 10 years. He fell under the influence of a fanatical priest who told him fiction was sin and his book was spiritually dangerous. Then, one February night in 1852, at 3 a.m, Gogol woke his servant boy, went to the stove, and fed 10 years of work into the fire, page by page. The boy begged him to stop. When it was done, Gogol wept and said the devil had tricked him into it. After that night, he refused food. Doctors tried everything, and 19th century Russian medicine meant leeches on your face, so everything made it worse. 9 days after burning his masterpiece, Gogol was dead. He was 42. Here's the detail that keeps scholars up at night. Fragments of Part 2 survived in drafts, meaning the finished version, the one he burned, was fuller, better, complete. The greatest Russian novel of the century exists. We're just never allowed to read it. Book number 3 didn't ruin its author with scandal or fire. It made him famous. And then famous wasn't enough to save him from one of the strangest deaths in literary history. In 1845, Edgar Allan Poe published The Raven, a poem about a man slowly losing his mind while a bird tells him, "Nevermore." It went viral, 19th century style. Kids followed Poe down the street flapping their arms. Strangers quoted it at him in restaurants. He was, overnight, the most famous writer in America. He was paid about $9 for it. Even adjusted for inflation, that's, let's call it the worst royalty deal in history. So, Poe stayed poor, kept writing about death, premature burials, and hearts beating under floorboards, and then decided to live out his own final mystery. October 1849. Poe leaves Richmond, heading to Philadelphia. He vanishes for 6 days. Then he's found on a Baltimore street, delirious, unable to explain anything, and wearing someone else's clothes. Cheap, Ill-fitting clothes that witnesses swore weren't his. He's taken to a hospital, spends 4 nights raving at shadows, repeatedly calls out the name Reynolds, a name no one has conclusively identified to this day, and dies at 40. Cause of death? Unknown. Every record conveniently lost. The theories range from rabies to political kidnapping. Back then, gangs drugged random men and dragged them from polling station to vote in disguise. Which would explain the clothes. Maybe. The man who invented the detective story left behind a case no detective ever solved. For over 70 years, a masked stranger visited his grave every January, left 3 roses and a half bottle of cognac, and disappeared. Nobody ever found out who that was either. Nevermore indeed. Poe's curse was solved by no one. The next author tried to make sure there would be nothing left to solve. He ordered his life's work destroyed, and the curse is that we're reading it anyway. Franz Kafka wrote The Trial. A man is arrested one morning for a crime that is never named, by a court that no one can find, under a law that no one has read. It's the most accurate novel about bureaucracy ever written, which is impressive because it's also a nightmare that feels like drowning in paperwork. Kafka never finished it. He never finished most things. He had tuberculosis, crippling self-doubt, and a day job at an insurance office, which explains a lot about his fiction. Before he died in 1924, at 40, he wrote a letter to his best friend Max Brod with one instruction: burn everything. Diaries, manuscripts, letters, all of it, unread. Brod's response? He published everything. The Trial, The Castle, America, the entire legacy of the 20th century's most influential writer exists because his best friend looked at his dying wish and said no. So, is that loyalty or betrayal? Here's Brod's defense. He'd told Kafka to his face years earlier that he would never do it. If Kafka truly wanted his work destroyed, he'd have asked literally anyone else. Or, a stove. Gogol managed it. The curse followed the manuscripts themselves. Brod smuggled them out of Prague in 1939 on the last train before the Nazis closed the border. Decades later, what remained ended up in a Tel Aviv apartment, hoarded by his secretary's daughters, among dozens of cats, while 3 countries fought over them in court for years. A man who wrote about endless, absurd legal battles left behind papers that spent a decade trapped in one. And now the book from the intro, the one that refused to die. Every curse on this list ends with a death or a mystery. This one ends with a book coming back from the ashes, in a country where it was never supposed to exist. Moscow, the 1930s. Stalin's Soviet Union, atheist by law, terrified by design. And Mikhail Bulgakov is secretly writing a novel where the devil himself arrives in Moscow, exposes the entire city's greed and cowardice, throws a supernatural ball for the damned, and somehow ends up being the most honest character in town. There's also a gun-toting talking cat the size of a pig. It's exactly as glorious as it sounds. Writing this under Stalin wasn't brave, it was suicidal. Bulgakov knew it could never be published. Friends who read pages told him, quote, hide it deeper. And in 1930, after the state banned his plays, he did what cursed authors apparently do. He burned the manuscript. But here's where this story breaks the pattern. Gogol burned his book and died. Bulgakov burned his book and started over. From memory, every chapter rebuilt. And into the new draft, he wrote the line the novel is now famous for. In the story, the devil returns the master's destroyed novel with a shrug and 4 words. Manuscripts don't burn. Bulgakov spent his last years dictating corrections from his deathbed, blind, dying, still editing. His final recorded words about the novel were, so that they know. He died in 1940 with the book unpublished, hidden in a drawer by his widow Elena, who guarded it for over a quarter of a century. 1966. The Soviet Union is still the Soviet Union, and a Moscow literary magazine somehow prints it. Censored, cut, but alive. It detonated. People typed the missing passages by hand and passed them around like contraband. The book the state made sure could never exist became the most beloved Russian novel of the century. And the curse? Ask anyone who's tried to film it. For 50 years, adaptation after adaptation collapsed. Directors died, funding vanished, productions imploded, until The Curse of the Master and Margarita became its own legend in Russian cinema. The devil, apparently, protects his own copyright. 5 books, 5 curses. But notice the pattern. Every single one of these books outlived the person who tried to control it. The courts, the censors, even the authors themselves. Maybe that's the real curse of writing something true. It stops being yours. And if you think a cursed book is scary, the scariest novel of the 19th century was written by an 18-year-old girl on a dare during a summer so dark it didn't happen. That story is next. Subscribe so you don't miss it.